you both very much for being here today. I wonder if I could ask you both to give us an introduction, just a little bit about your background, so that we know more about you. Shayna?
Hi, I'm Shayna Lewis. I'm a Sudan specialist and senior advisor with PAEMA, which is Preventing and Ending Mass Atrocities. And we work on community-driven atrocity prevention in Sudan, Myanmar, and the DRC.
I am here on a personal capacity. So previously I was the CEO of Shabaka, a diaspora organization focused on diaspora engagement, humanitarian action, and also a research associate at the University of Sussex, specializing in migration and humanitarian policy. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Shayna, could I put the first question to you? So we've got questions, but please, we want it to be a conversation, so come in on each other's, or bring us more information if you want. But I wonder if you could give us an understanding of what you've of what you've witnessed when you've visited Sudan recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So my last trip into Sudan was in June of this year, where I traveled to Port Sudan and into Khartoum. This was only a couple of weeks after the Sudanese armed forces had recaptured the city from the RSF following 2 years of control. And what I witnessed in the capital was the systematic destruction of Sudan's healthcare system at the hands of the Rapid Support Forces. I visited many of the public hospitals in the capital, including El Bullock Hospital, the only functioning pediatric hospital in the entire state, as well as Ahmed Gassim, one of the main cardiac and renal transplant centers in the country. And what I saw was astonishing. Anything that the RSF could not carry out to sell or destroy, they attempted to destroy in situ. And this included, in one of the facilities, all of the pediatric ventilators in the ICU, because they wanted to remove the ability of children to breathe, and also the destruction of the country's only cardiac MRI machine. They also removed all of the electrical infrastructure from certain facilities, from the cables to the batteries in an entire hospital, stripped away all of the cables under the floorboards. And when that wasn't enough, they smelted down the electrical infrastructure inside the hospital itself, transforming a hospital, a beacon of life amidst the landscape of war, into an incinerator. And because this is all happening, I think it's a challenge to understand the scale of the destruction until you start to frame this rather than a war between two parties, and instead as a war by two parties and their external backers against the civilians of Sudan. Sudan's medical system was concentrated on Khartoum before the war started, and many of these hospitals received referrals from across Sudan's other 17 states. And even during the war, the medical directors at El Nau and El Bullock hospitals recounted to me how they had received patients as far away as South Darfur, Niala, which was under RSF control. So many of the needs in Sudan at this point, when we think about the humanitarian response, are actually developmental. They are medium to long-term investments that are needed, and they will require the systematic rebuilding of the country's infrastructure to ensure access to healthcare for all, and the protection of civilians without discrimination on any ethnic, racial, geographical, or gendered basis. But if I may for a moment, I'd just like to root us in what is happening right now in Sudan. As many of you will be aware, the city of El Fasher fell yesterday to the RSF. This was SAF's final remaining base in all of Darfur. And I noted the comments of some in the committee earlier, and unfortunately this is already an epochal moment that will go down in infamy alongside Rwanda and Srebrenica and Gaza.
Why do you say that?
Because for the past 48 hours, teams such as my own have been reviewing footage from El Fasher. And fundamentally, we've been warning about the risk of mass atrocities in El Fasher, including with briefings to FCDO for 2 years at this point. We went back this morning and counted all of the briefings that we have delivered over the past 2 years. The first one was in October of last year, and we have submitted 20 briefings to the international community. I myself have briefed the Security Council twice in the past 9 months on the situation, including on El Fasher, and this is an abject failure of the international community to engage in any prevention initiatives. I was quite frankly astonished by Baroness Chapman's remarks that they had not been able to pursue atrocity prevention because it's not What we've seen now is a lack of political will, fundamentally. There are a range of tools. There is a very active civil society community of experts who have been engaged and have been putting forward proposals on what can be done to save civilians, to engage on the civilian protection threats across Sudan, and they have not been taken seriously.
Can you give us some examples of what that would look like?
Absolutely. So we think that one of the main threats to civilians in our analysis is actually the ongoing telecommunications blackout, which has been persisting since February of last year. We frame it in this way because it underpins so many of the other threats that happen in the country. When we think about the humanitarian response, it's the difference between the trucks that have been leaving Port Sudan and traveling across country, the teams, the UN agencies being able to still maintain contact with their teams once they leave Port Sudan. And when I was there in June, they recounted that once they leave Port Sudan, they're in a blackout. So even just coordinating distributions on the ground has been incredibly hindered by the blackout. If we turn over to some of the questions you've been asking about accountability, well, the documentation that is happening on the ground is entirely being led by Sudanese, particularly young Sudanese women who are putting their lives on the line every day when they step forward to document the atrocities on the ground. And they all rely on the internet to share that information with the wider world. And it's not just human rights documenters, it's also the journalists who are doing this work on the ground, collecting evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So how can they do that when the internet has been weaponized? We were previously kind of told that the telecommunications networks were damaged and that there had been significant infrastructure that needed to be repaired. But we have not had any independent technical assessment teams that have gone in to assess the damage. And the Sudanese
From the UK or from anywhere?
From anywhere. And the Sudanese armed forces have had control of the capital, which is where these centres are located, since March or April of this year. And there has still been no initiative there. One of the other ways that the international community could tackle the telecommunications blackout is by funding the work of the Emergency Telecommunications Cluster that sits within the UN and is primarily engaged with ensuring access for humanitarians. And they've been doing a fantastic job, particularly in the east of the country and now in the centre. But part of their mandate is also to ensure access for civilians. And I've been meeting with them for months, and they have told us that because of the aid cuts this year, they are not able to pursue any kind of improvement in access to civilians, even though they met with civilians in Darfur who beseeched them to take this forward as a priority. So a lot of this, unfortunately, comes down to the issue of funding and political will, and we're not seeing either of those, particularly from the UK government. And I'd also just really like to reinforce that this failure that we're seeing on atrocity prevention is also what you as a committee warned about in your report on atrocity prevention, that without concerted action, quote, mass atrocities are likely to become more common, which will constrain global development. And we're seeing this play out in real time. And just to colour that a little bit, we know many people who've been working in this area for a long time. We know many people who left El Fasher previously and are now finding out that their loved ones are dead by viewing footage of the summary executions that are now circulating all over social media. Because again, the telecommunications blackout means that it is now impossible to speak to anyone in El Fasher. The only lifeline that the Darfur region previously had was Starlink. And when civilians are running for their lives with, if they're lucky, one bag of items, they are not setting up a Starlink device and ensuring it has an eye line. So they're in a total blackout. The only documentation we have right now is either the satellite imagery that groups like the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab are providing, or it's the self-recorded footage of these atrocities by the RSF. And unfortunately, it's too little too late for a lot of these populations, but what can be done now is surging the humanitarian response for El Fasher, because those who are able to flee need a lot of assistance. As we heard previously, the response in Tooele is only 50% funded at the moment, but I'll pause there.
The thing, and you're hitting on what this committee has been wrestling with for years. I mean, it's arguably the biggest humanitarian crisis on the planet. We're looking at not just the casualties of war, not just the atrocities that are going on, the famine, I think there's a cholera outbreak, the systematic destruction of the medical facilities, education, etc., etc., etc. Why do you think the world doesn't care?
I wish there were an easy answer to that question. I think part of it is, I'll start with the most frustrating one. I think part of it is this racist attitude of this being another war in Africa between Africans. And fundamentally, this war is bigger than Sudan, right? The risk of regional destabilization, which we have seen play out in real time over almost 3 years now, the region is a powder keg, and we were lucky earlier in the year that South Sudan did not go differently. But we are still watching those dynamics very, very closely. I think what we heard earlier from the minister questioning the kind of lack of attention that we're getting from Parliament, there are some very strong parliamentarians, many of you who are in the room, who have been putting in those urgent questions and trying to keep Sudan on the agenda, and we need much more of that initiative. I would love if we had more mass lobbying days, more engagement with parliamentarians. But in terms of that chicken and egg of who's driving who, there is a vacuum of leadership within the British government right now on Sudan. And we have seen this over years. At least in the last government, we had the achievement of Resolution 2736 in the Security Council, which was specifically on al-Fasher. But again, since that moment, there has been a lack of political will around implementation. And I said it in the Security Council, without that political will, these resolutions are just pieces of paper. So until there is more impetus globally, and particularly until there is targeting of the external backers and naming of the external backers, I was so happy to hear, Ms. Champion, that you named the UAE earlier, because it is so rare, and I'm thinking through on the international stage who has named the external backers, and it's the secret in the room, yet somehow we have the Quad process in the US, which is the people with the most leverage, and has Egypt, and has Saudi Arabia, and has the UAE. But why are they the countries that we're convening? Well, they're because they are the external backers. And the report that came out today in The Guardian is damning on the actions of this government. I really have to question why the UK in September 2024 provided an open individual export license for some of those materials that you were referencing, Ms. Harding, when in at least January of that year, the UN had a report that very clearly stated the link of the UAE supplying weapons to the RSF. So why did we then have that export license that went out when what that meant in practice was that unlimited quantities of exports were sent without monitoring needs? So if we already know there is this link, it is not good enough for the minister to then sit here and say, well, I'm not an arms expert, I'm also not an arms expert. But fundamentally, it is the responsibility of this government to know where the weapons they are selling are going to, and if there is any implication that they are involved on the battlefield in Sudan, then that is a violation of the Darfur arms embargo. And frankly, we should be considering whether there should be sanctions for violations of those arms embargo.
Let me bring Sam in at this point.
Gosh.
No.
Thank you for your evidence so far. You heard me ask earlier on about the role of local organisations and the fact that in these situations often the larger development actors vacate the field. So given the critical role of local organisations, what practical steps do you feel the UK government should be taking, or could or should be taking, to overcome, I guess, the issues that you heard mentioned around compliance and risk and so on, that, you know, those barriers that are preventing us from getting the aid to where it's needed?
Yeah, no, thank you. Quite an important question, considering that. And I think also just to say, Sudan is an important test case on the whole humanitarian reset. So the exact failure in terms of not realising local-led action is quite important. I think there's been for a long time this understanding that these mutual aid groups are temporary until the professionals come in, and this is 2.5 years later. And the reality is that these are the groups who have the most access, who are able to respond, and even now in the current situation in al-Fasher, most of the people I've been speaking to have been the mutual aid groups who are on the ground, who are dealing and providing the information and who's doing what and such. So why do we have the red tape in terms of that? So I think there's a lot of that kind of feels like, oh, we don't know where it's going to go. But there's actually a higher degree of transparency within these groups because they have to respond to their communities. There needs to be kind of more stronger mechanisms in terms of how do you do that at scale. So I think the point that was raised earlier by Liz and by others is one of the challenges for British Office Sudan and other contexts is they don't have enough staffing to manage these programs. But this is already happening. You have, I would say, for example, philanthropy groups have really kind of taken up the mantle on this front in terms of providing that support for locally led, for mutual aid groups on the ground. To have only 1.5% going directly to these groups who are dealing with the majority of the response is unacceptable, and it's a shame on everyone. And when people say it's unusual in Sudan, this has actually been practiced in numerous other countries, so we actually need to look at elsewhere. Myanmar is being done, Syria, all these contexts. So the fact that it's seen as in a vacuum in just Sudan context, I think is a mistake. So there are successes, and there's ways of doing it. It's just the appetite, the political appetite to be able to do something like that.
Give us an example of a success and a way to do it.
In the sense of, I'll refer to Syria. You had parts of Syria in the north at the time before the current government came into play, where international organizations could not access. You had Syrian organizations who are really kind of taking the lead. They're the ones who were taking all the risks, but were actually the ones delivering the aid and responding. And the majority, so no one could provide any of that aid, and this had happened for years. In Sudan, the UN, I think the first time they went into the capital was only, last December? That was the first time they gone into Khartoum. And even now, with the UN, with the INGOs, they might be demanding more funds and all of this. They've seen the infrastructure that can provide support and assistance at large scale, but the reality is there's a lot of limitation. They have a lot of red tape, and just do not have this kind of access. So they actually work with mutual aid groups as partners, as the groups who kind of deliver on that. So they are essentially the intermediaries in many ways. And I think this is something that needs to be understood in terms of Sudan context, but also looking at what's happening in other countries. So if we look at Syria, as I mentioned again, look at Myanmar, this is already being done.
If I could add on some of the examples, there are many Sudanese local NGOs who were not only operating in the past 2 years, but before the war started. And that is more than just the emergency response rooms who are doing fantastic work, but there are also a whole set of mutual aid initiatives that, as Michelle said, are flourishing, but have not received funding from the international community. I know groups, more flexible humanitarian funding groups, who have been directly funding these groups and have very positive results. There are groups that are operating in Darfur who are the only ones who've been doing aid distributions across the entire region, including in all of the RSF-controlled areas, but are not being recognized at the international level, and I will not name now because it is not safe for them. But this work is already happening on the ground. These groups, Sudanese groups, are often the only ones with access to these communities. So the fact that nations around the world continue to prioritize funding the large INGOs or UN agencies is a real lack of understanding of how aid is currently flowing into Sudan, and it really needs that reinvigorated approach that you referred to earlier. The ERRs are one example, but there are many on the ground, and it's really on us to develop the new approach. I'll just mention that US aid, up until its dismantling, shall we say, was the largest donor to the ERRs. And there was a very long process within US aid of working out how to do that direct funding, but they eventually were able to pull it off. And part of that was because the ERRs developed their own reporting system, which, as Bashar mentioned, is downward looking. It is accountability to their own communities. And then they were able to convey the information to their donor. But it needs a new approach from the UK government because, we're in 2025.
Anyone stepped into that gap?
Absolutely no one.
Just quickly, if we were to have access to those communities right now and they were sitting giving evidence instead of you, and now is to ask them the question, sort of, what is it that you're asking for from us, and what is it you really lack, and what is it you've lacked, particularly since that funding left? What are they likely to say?
I think there's many ways they kind of do it. It depends where they are. Some of them want ceasefire, they want protection. So it's not always just about the money. I think this is something that's quite important, and this is kind of the evolving needs on the ground. There's that reality. You already have these resources, so you have the massive diaspora who actually fund many of these groups as well, who are able to provide that access.
And fund the mutual aid groups?
Yeah, they fund mutual aid groups, and also in terms of it's also cost effectiveness. If you work through mutual aid groups, about 95% of the money goes directly into the communities. But once you start doing with the layers, it's probably about 65% when you go with the international organizations. And when you have multiple layers, we did a back of the envelope calculations at some point. And by the time you take from the big UN to the local groups, it can take about 11 months. It will, at each stage, and rightly, overhead costs, so they will vary between 7 and 12%. The maths is there. So it's not about lack of evidence, it's about people resistance to the new way of working, which is, this is a professional, this is a red tape. So sometimes the issue is not with the funders, but it's the middle belt, essentially, with intermediaries. So there might be a philanthropy who want to send the money on the ground. They're like, we have 5 million, we just want to channel it. But once you kind of go through all these steps and the due diligence processes, it's all gets tied up in compliance. And what's the ambition? Is have perfect paperwork or saving lives? So really you have to look at it that way.
You understand it's not free money. The governments have to account for it. It's taxpayers' money, and so that, but I understand the point that you're making. Monica?
I really want to drill down on the accountability, if I may, and what practical steps we can make. But first of all, if I can just return back to what you were saying about why there is no kind of public consciousness of this and the blackout. I mean, we are receiving information about human rights atrocities. The American administration under Biden called it a genocide. This information is coming out, and you said it's just another African war, and that's why people aren't interested. But you know, I know the parallel is probably unhelpful, but if you look at the Gaza, what's happened in Gaza, it was another Middle Eastern, conflagration, and yet people were still interested and still very, very focused in on it. Why is it that this hasn't kind of captured the public imagination?
I think it's just because you don't have a clear story about the conflict on Sudan. People's like, we need a clear bad guy or good guy, or it's a complicated conflict. Yeah. So when you start explaining to people, you will lose people in the process. There was issues of access. People want to see photos and all of that. So it doesn't appeal in that. But racism is certainly a big part of that as well. It's like, another war, it looks just about the same. So there is that kind of multiple levels. So there's no one answer, but it's multiple reasons. I would love to speak to a behavioral scientist in terms of just to kind of work out the rationale behind it. But at the end of the day, is we're dealing with the consequences. UK government should not be dealing with what's easy messaging, but what are the responsibilities and what can be done. And what I'm kind of would love to kind of hear more as well is, yes, there's accountability, but it can be done without formal structures. There are already processes and pathways to do that. You can support unregistered groups. So you don't have to have the pressure from the media, but you have the communities, you have Sudanese diaspora who have been at your doorsteps, of parliamentarians, all parliamentary groups who've been trying to raise this, but no response.
I'll push you a little bit further. You said there's more that the UK should be doing. I raised with the Minister, because we are the pen holder, both for Sudan and for protection of civilians, I agree, we should be doing more, but what more should we be doing?
Sure. Yeah. We do a lot of engagement at PAEMA with the Security Council on Sudan. I think the last experts briefing that I delivered was about 2 weeks ago, and pretty other than a few of the P5, everyone was present, including the incoming members of the council. So there is engagement, and particularly at the expert level, there is a lot of desire to do something on Sudan. But the UK has a little bit of a reputational problem at the moment, I'll be frank.
What way?
Russia was categorical after vetoing the, I believe it was November of last year, Civilian Protection Resolution, that they would veto anything that the UK put forward. Now, the UK is very protective of its penholder status, but what we really need is space for African member states to be able to step forwards and lead on some of these resolutions. And there have been initiatives such as joint statements that the UK has co-authored with some of the African member states who are on the council, which have been strong statements over the past, I'd say, 5 months or so. So there's a little bit of movement in that way, and reconfiguring of the usual approach on Sudan. But I think part of the reason why we're not seeing much at the council is because the political gridlock that has infected the Gaza case file and the Ukraine case file has also spread to Sudan, and that is because of the role of the external backers. I'm sorry if I sound a little bit like a broken record, but we know that when the Sudanese armed forces the Port Sudan authorities tried to bring together an emergency session to specifically look at the UAE's involvement on Sudan, that the UK provided a lot of political cover. This was widely covered in the media, so I don't think I'm breaking any rules there. But why does the UK government continue to prioritize Emirati investments and political relationships over the lives of Sudanese on the ground? It's a country of 49 million people. I believe it's almost 30 million people who are currently in need of humanitarian assistance. And what we're seeing on the ground in Al Fasher right now is the worst at this moment, but it is not the only crisis that is occurring across the country. If you look at the western region of the Kordofans, there are also very similar siege tactics that the RSF is employing, medieval siege tactics, where they are constructing walls around cities in South Kordofan and other areas of the country, and they are preventing civilians from fleeing or goods from entering the cities. And yes, Al Fasher and these other areas, and the massacre that took place on the 26th in Bara, where hundreds of civilians were killed by the RSF over a 24 to 48 hour window. West Kordofan as well. Ms. Harding, just to come back to your question of why we're not seeing the engagement versus other conflicts, I think it comes back to the telecommunications blackout and the fact that we are not seeing the same level of imagery that we saw on Gaza. It was really the brutality of those images of children being bombed in their homes that broke through into the public consciousness and really changed things internationally. And what we're seeing in Sudan, frankly, I do a lot of engagement with the media. Most of what I receive cannot be published because it is too graphic. When we receive videos of someone being beheaded or disemboweled in Sudan, there's nothing that anyone can do with that. They can't even describe the footage. So there's this question of not just what is available, but also humanizing what is happening in Sudan. These big statistics mean nothing. Yeah. I see policymaker eyes glaze over in briefing after briefing when we go in with these statistics. And that is part of why, as an advocate, it is so important for us to get on the ground to be able to amplify stories, but also important for Sudanese to be able to sit at these policy-making tables themselves and be given a platform. But part of the problem here, we had tried to facilitate a delegation of Sudanese women who were involved in the response to the UK. And we were working very closely with FCDO on this. This was around the London conference, right up until the last minute when it got to the visa process. And then we were told by FCDO, oh, there's nothing we can do about the visas. If that sounds strange to you, it's because it doesn't add up. It's the UK government.
David Inks has done quite a bit of work on this.
Yeah, I mean, so do you think there's anything more that we can do? I mean, I put it to the Minister because I agree with you. I mean, I feel the government could do more to highlight and focus on the issues. We haven't had a proactive statement from the government, and indeed in questions we've had, and we had one today, but I've asked that question. Others have asked the question. We've never had an answer in relation to the UAE when it's asked on the floor of the House. I mean, obviously, I think this today is an opportunity, and which you're taking forward very articulately, in terms of getting more information and views out. But do you think there is more we could do as parliamentarians in terms of trying to escalate the issue?
I do think that Parliament could be doing more, and I think it's a lot of what you're already doing. I hear from parliamentarians that when your constituents come to office hours and are raising Sudan, that it is then translating to the floor of the Commons. But there needs to just be more engagement across the board. I'm not sure how, in the UK civil society space, what that engagement currently looks like with parliamentarians, and I think that's definitely something that we can improve on, and making sure that the briefings that we're sharing with FCDO, we're also sharing more widely. But we need the urgent questions, considering that this is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world and the largest protection crisis in the world. This should be on the agenda every single week. And because of the UK's role as a leader on Sudan, morally and also politically, it should always be here. We were a little bit confused previously when Foreign Secretary Lamy would repeatedly say that Sudan was one of his #1 priorities as Foreign Secretary, and why we were then seeing the disconnect between this stated level of ambition and the lack of output from FCDO. And I think the previous briefing detailed a lot of that gap, the lack of funding. I know a lot of the UK office Sudan team, and they are fantastic, particularly the staff who came out of Sudan and are still doing this work, when on a daily basis they're getting reports of their family who are still in Sudan. But there are many more who could be brought into that team, and again, it comes back to that funding piece.
And just to echo what you just said already, but to add just briefly, there are some practical steps that can be taken, so kind of in terms of the commitment. So for example, for local aid, supporting mutual aid groups, and working with diaspora, why can't there be like a 60% allocated directly to go to mutual aid groups for next year? With the diaspora, it's ad hoc, a lot of complaints about it, and this is across the board, because you have to think generationally. So why can't there be a diaspora committee, or and instead of this ad hoc engagement? That could be a very practical step to do that. In terms of the humanitarian reset, Sudan is a test case. So why aren't you building the processes that, to be able to apply, not just in Sudan context, but other contexts? Humanitarian crises are not going to end anytime soon. They're going to be getting more complicated. So why put the blueprint now, instead of waiting, responding ad hoc, which will be more expensive, more challenging, and will just put you in the back foot in terms of the responses. And also just kind of understanding that, protection is not negotiable. So waiting for it's like, we can't stop it now, but we will deal with justice later. That's not acceptable. So there needs to be that. I'm very sad that I had to, I've been covering Sudan, working on Sudan for more than 2 decades, and I covered the Darfur conflict, the first one. The same reports I've written, I just had to change the dates, not even the locations, maybe adding more locations. And the engagement then was very, very different.
Very different.
What way?
There was more political will and more engagement to put pressure on the warring parties, on the different groups, to stop the atrocities. There was, UN Security Council resolutions, you had peacekeeping. There was a lot more pressure to stop atrocities, and the situation could have been much worse at the time. It was horrific because you had genocide then. But now, what's happening in Al-Fashir has already happened in Wad Madani, it happened in Khartoum, it could happen again. So we might be, in a couple of months' time, we're going to be here, oh my God, we can't believe we've done that. So all you're going to see is a repetition. So I think that kind of lack of engagement, to me, is day and night in terms of how the UK government had responded 20 years ago and how it's responding now is unheard of.
Bring you in.
Thank you. Bashir, you mentioned a couple of times about the diaspora. How do you think the UK government could engage more effectively with the diaspora, with the organisations across the UK, to ensure that they're meaningfully integrated into the UK's response to the crisis in Sudan?
I think and this is something I've been advocating for quite a long time, there needs to be a diaspora policy to kind of guide this. Ireland has one, the US has one, it's actually happening in several countries in terms of how you do that. So not waiting for a crisis to happen to do these engagements. And it happens also in future for trade. So having a diaspora policy to guide that, have a dedicated, doesn't have to be a whole team. I know it can be quite an expense, but have at least one resource person to kind of do these engagements, hearing the messages. The diaspora is not one thing, so they're not all going to be coming with the same vision through that. And that usually scares everyone. So I've had this complaint quite a few times, like, there's too many different diasporas, you're not on the same page. Of course not. You're dealing with a whole country of people coming here. Look at your own constituencies. Could you imagine bringing all of the different ones there? It will be an interesting discussion. So that consistency in terms of the engagement, it can happen. There's also that division. Is it going to happen here at FCD office Sudan and South Sudan desk here, or at British office Sudan? There's that tension as well to take into consideration. So how is that going to happen to deal with Sudanese in the different countries, but also Sudanese diaspora here specifically in the UK? But this ad hoc engagement with specific individuals because you know them, because you have the connection. So to date, very much those who have access are those who are known to specific members.
The structures that you suggested are like the model in Ireland and US, are the kind of thing that you would think would work?
Something to kind of consider. So the US is a completely different beast in terms of the configurations, but in the UK there could be something specific that works for the UK. In Ireland it looks also very different for that. Germany don't have a policy, but they do kind of diaspora engagement, have the specific programs. So there could be specific policy that is unique to the UK with the type of population in terms of the migration histories, because you're dealing with migration histories that will vary, whether they came back in from the early 1990s or more recent. So there's that to deal with that diversity. There was an interesting one that the US Special Envoy did, which was town halls, regular ones, town halls, to do this kind of engagement. So that could be one way of doing it. I'll be more than happy to share kind of more suggestions and details, because we've done a few, like in my previous job, we've done quite a few papers on these policies. So we'll do that.
I think if I could just add, it's also a question of who are the diaspora having access to. Because it's one thing to be speaking with parliamentarians, but it's another to be speaking with the decision makers within government. And we, amongst civil society, have recognised that a lot of these foreign policy decisions are not being made by FCDO or even the Foreign Secretary, but are actually being made at the level of the Prime Minister's Foreign Policy Advisor, which, as far as I'm aware, no one in civil society, despite over a year of engaging, has been able to secure a meeting with. And that is an issue at the diaspora level. It's an issue for experts who are trying to engage and understand what the blocks are on UK policy progress and leadership. And if that's one thing that the committee could take forward, it is helping to break down some of those barriers so that these communication channels can be working both ways. Because as much as we're trying to understand more about the international intractability, we as experts who are doing this day in and day out have a raft of resources and information that we can also be sharing, that the UK government does not have the capacity to be engaging at this level on a daily basis at the grassroots and national level. So it needs to be those back and forth communication channels, and at the moment we're not seeing that as much as should be happening.
So it's not just about diaspora engagement, it's about civil society as a whole engagement.
Yeah, and that has definitely been a struggle for us in engaging with this government.
This government, so you've seen a change in the last 16 months?
Yes.
How unfortunate. No, how unfortunate.
Yeah.
But how though?
How? We were previously able to engage with the teams under the previous government much more easily. They were very willing to have these meetings with us. And in the initial period when the government came in, there seemed to be a blanket policy of not engaging outwardly with any civil society. And after a couple of months, that seemed to change. There was some loosening. But there still seems to be, even amongst some ministers, this kind of reticence to view civil society as a resource at all. And that is a real shame. Because yes, we will often say the hard things that I think governments would rather that we didn't. But as I said, we are a resource, and
having a critical friend is a blessing. It's
thank you.
To be scared of.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Any more questions from anyone?
Sorry. You go. Could you?
No, just I mean, perhaps it's one for the future, but I'd be interested to see some of the evidence around that in terms of pushback, like refusal, because we gather evidence as well as testimony, right, of attempts to engage and letters declining now compared to before.
Oh, I'd be happy to share those.
Thank you.
I just have a final question on political leadership. You talked about a lack of political leadership. Why? Why do you think there's a lack of political leadership on it?
I mean, I really think that was a question for the Minister and for the Africa Director. Why is there the lack of political leadership? I think partly because they can afford to continue viewing Sudan as an issue that doesn't directly affect them when it really does. This is an issue for the UK, not just because of the potential migration impacts that have been noted by previous speakers, but really because of that regional destabilization that I was talking about. We're currently discussing are Ethiopia and Eritrea on the brink of war again. And part of that is to do with the Sudan dynamics and the fact that there are troops that are being trained in Eritrea from who are aligned with the Sudanese armed forces. That has, again, been well documented by the UN panel of experts. Egypt is hosting over 1 million Sudanese at the moment, but the economic situation in Egypt is far from stable right now. And then they're also dealing with Gaza on the eastern border. To continue around, Libya is hardly a bastion of stability in the region, and Haftar is currently implicated in a lot of what is happening in the triangle border area between Chad, Libya, and Sudan. And in Chad as well, the minister said that Adre had been a tiny town before the conflict started, but there were almost 500,000 Sudanese who were displaced and settled or living in displacement camps in eastern Chad, who were displaced during the Darfur conflict from 2003 onwards. So Chad has had a long history of playing host to Sudanese communities across that border. But Chad, again, is dealing with a lot of internal political dynamics. They had the election at the beginning of the year, where thankfully there was not an eruption of conflict that was expected, and we were all very grateful for that. South Sudan, I won't touch on in a lot of detail, but is implicated in what is happening in Sudan right now, and different sides have backed different parties. And I think I've done all of the bordering countries except for the Central African Republic, which I'm not going to touch. But these regional issues affect the UK, whether or not we deal with them today or if we deal with them in 5 years' time. And it's whether we want to try and engage in peace building now to contain the potential threats to UK domestic security now, or when they have escalated further on down the line. Ms. Harding, I'll just note that I didn't really engage on your question on accountability, and I'm so sorry, so if I could just touch on that now.
Briefly, if you don't mind.
Very briefly. It all comes down to Sudanese documenters, because the fact-finding mission that was mentioned earlier and the ICC investigators do not have access to Sudan. They haven't since the beginning of the war. So they are relying on evidence that is being collected by Sudanese documentation groups. And I'll just note that when I was in the region in August and September of this year, I met with many of these groups, and 83% of them told me that they have no funding pledge for 2026. So this is a fundamental question about how not only domestic but international accountability can continue, and also the fact that we need accountability not, on the same timeline that we saw for the Ali Khashab case, which was almost 2 decades before we reached a verdict at the ICC, but also accountability now for what is happening across the country. And that is possible through pursuing sanctions that target both sides and also the external backers.
I listened closely and the Minister didn't use that word once. You've given us loads of evidence and loads of things to follow up on. If you want to submit more to us, that would be very helpful as well. We won't let this go, but I do appreciate there is much, much, much more that could, should, needs to be done. But thank you both for giving us so much good intelligence and delivering it so well. We really, really appreciate your time. Thank you all very much. Order. This session is